The morning sun cast long shadows across the military academy's pristine courtyard as Sarah Martinez adjusted her worn leather boots for the 100th time that week. The boots were old, weathered, and bore the unmistakable signs of years of use. Deep scratches marred their surface, and the leather had faded from its original black to a dull brown in places. Most noticeably, there was a significant tear along the right boot side that Sarah had carefully stitched back together with whatever thread she could find. Sarah stood at attention with the other cadets during morning inspection, her heart racing as she noticed the sideways glances and barely suppressed snickers from her fellow trainees. She had hoped that today would be different, that perhaps no one would notice or comment on her footwear. But, as Cadet James Richardson, the Academy's golden boy whose father was a decorated colonel, stepped closer during the break, she knew her hopes were misplaced. "Look at Martinez's boots," James whispered loudly enough for the surrounding cadets to hear. "Did she find those in a garbage dump?" The comment sparked a wave of muffled laughter among the group. Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. The truth was that Sarah's family couldn't afford new military boots. Her mother worked double shifts at a local diner, and her father had been laid off from the factory 6 months ago. When Sarah received her acceptance letter to the prestigious West Point Military Academy, it had been a dream come true, but the financial reality quickly set in. The uniform allowance barely covered the basics, and boots were considered a personal expense that each cadet's family was expected to handle. Sarah had begged her parents to let her find a job to earn money for proper boots, but they insisted she focus on her studies. Her mother had surprised her one evening by presenting her with the old boots, explaining that they had belonged to Sarah's grandfather, who had served in Vietnam. "They're not pretty," her mother had said with tears in her eyes, "but they carried a good man through difficult times. Maybe they'll do the same for you." Now, standing in formation while her classmates continued their cruel commentary, Sarah wondered if her mother's faith had been misplaced. Cadet Jennifer Walsh, whose designer boots gleamed in the morning light, joined the chorus of mockery. "I heard her family shops at thrift stores," Jennifer said with a cruel smile. "Maybe we should start a charity fund for Martinez's wardrobe." The verbal assault continued throughout the day. During combat training, Sarah's boots became the subject of running jokes. When she stumbled slightly during an obstacle course, Cadet Thompson shouted, "Maybe if Martinez had real boots instead of those antiques, she could actually keep up." The comment earned approving laughs from the group of cadets who seemed to take particular pleasure in Sarah's discomfort. Despite the humiliation, Sarah pushed herself harder than anyone else. She arrived early for every training session, stayed late to practice drills, and studied military tactics long into the night while her tormentors enjoyed their leisure time. She was determined to prove that her worth as a soldier had nothing to do with the quality of her footwear and everything to do with the strength of her character and commitment to service. During lunch breaks, Sarah often ate alone, her worn boots tucked under the table as much as possible. She had tried approaching other cadets for friendship, but most seemed to view her as a charity case or an outsider who didn't belong in their elite circle. The isolation was perhaps more painful than the direct mockery. She began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake in pursuing her military dreams. The mockery reached its peak during a particularly brutal training exercise in the Academy's mud pit. As cadets low-crawled through thick, sticky mud, Sarah's already damaged boots took even more punishment. The stitching she had so carefully repaired began to give way, and by the end of the exercise, her right boot was barely holding together. The sight of her deteriorating footwear sent the other cadets into fresh fits of laughter. "Martinez needs to super glue those things back together," one cadet called out as they headed back to the barracks. "Or maybe she should just go barefoot. It might be an improvement." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic agreement from the group, and Sarah felt her last reserves of confidence crumbling. That evening, alone in her small dorm room, Sarah carefully examined her boots by lamplight. The damage was worse than she had initially thought. The stitching was coming apart in multiple places, and there were new tears that she wasn't sure she could repair. She ran her fingers along the worn leather, tracing the scuffs and scratches that told the story of her grandfather's service and her own struggles. As she prepared for another attempt at repair, Sarah noticed something she had never seen before. In the dim light of her desk lamp, positioned at just the right angle, she could make out what appeared to be faint markings on the inside of the boot's tongue. She adjusted the lamp and looked closer, her heart beginning to race as she realized these weren't just random scratches or manufacturing marks. There was definitely something engraved in the leather, though it was so worn and faded that she could barely make it out. Sarah spent nearly an hour carefully examining both boots, discovering that each one bore similar markings. The engravings were clearly deliberate, though their meaning remained a mystery to her. She considered asking her mother about them, but decided against it, knowing that her parents were already stressed about the financial burden of her education. Instead, she carefully repaired what she could of the visible damage and went to bed, unaware that the secret hidden in her grandfather's boots would soon change everything. The next morning brought fresh humiliation as Sarah's classmates immediately noticed the obvious repair work on her boots. The crude stitching and mismatched thread became new targets for their ridicule. What none of them could have imagined was that within days, those same boots would command the respect and attention of the most powerful military officials in the country, and the young woman they had so casually dismissed would become the center of a story that would be told for generations. 3 days after Sarah's late-night discovery of the mysterious engravings, the Academy buzzed with unusual energy. Word had spread that General William Harrison, a living legend in the military community, would be conducting a surprise inspection of the Academy. General Harrison was known throughout the armed forces as a soldier's soldier, someone who had risen through the ranks through sheer determination and battlefield excellence rather than political connections or family influence. Sarah knew of General Harrison's reputation, though she had never seen him in person. Stories of his service in multiple conflicts had become the stuff of military folklore. More importantly for Sarah, she had heard that the general had little patience for privilege and always looked for genuine character in the soldiers under his command. As she prepared for the inspection, Sarah dared to hope that perhaps this would be her chance to prove herself based on merit rather than appearance. The cadets spent hours preparing for the general's arrival, polishing every visible surface and rehearsing their formations until they were flawless. Sarah worked twice as hard as anyone else, knowing that her boots would once again draw negative attention. She had done her best to clean and repair them, but there was only so much that could be done with such worn equipment. The other cadets, meanwhile, seemed to take special pleasure in the fact that Sarah's shabby appearance would be on full display for such an important visitor. Martinez is going to embarrass the whole academy, Cadet Richardson declared as he adjusted his pristine uniform in front of a mirror. Maybe they'll finally realize she doesn't belong here. His comment was met with nods of agreement from the surrounding cadets, who seemed to view Sarah's presence as a personal affront to their own status. When General Harrison arrived, his presence immediately commanded the attention of everyone on the academy grounds. He was a tall, imposing figure with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Unlike many high-ranking officials who conducted perfunctory inspections, the general took his time with each cadet, asking questions about their training, their goals, and their understanding of military principles. It quickly became apparent that this was not a man who could be impressed by surface appearances or family connections. The inspection proceeded smoothly for the first hour as General Harrison moved methodically through the ranks. Sarah watched nervously as he approached her section, noting how thoroughly he examined each cadet. When he stopped in front of Cadet Richardson, the young man's confident smile faltered as the general's questions revealed significant gaps in his understanding of basic military tactics. Richardson's expensive equipment and polished appearance meant nothing when faced with the general's penetrating assessment of his actual capabilities. When General Harrison finally stood before Sarah, she braced herself for the inevitable comments about her boots. The other cadets watched with barely concealed anticipation, expecting the general to either dismiss her immediately or deliver a harsh lecture about proper military appearance. Instead, the general studied her with the same intensity he had shown all the other cadets, his eyes taking in her posture, her alertness, and her obvious dedication to maintaining what equipment she had. "Cadet Martinez," the general said in his commanding voice, "I understand you've been excelling in your tactical studies despite some challenges." Sarah was surprised that he knew her name and academic performance. She had assumed that her achievements were overshadowed by the constant focus on her appearance. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied crisply, maintaining perfect military bearing despite her nervousness. She could sense the disappointment from her classmates, who had expected immediate criticism of her boots. The general nodded approvingly at her response, and seemed prepared to move on when something caught his eye. General Harrison's gaze had shifted downward, and he was now staring intently at Sarah's boots. The moment Sarah had been dreading had finally arrived. She prepared herself for humiliation in front of the most respected military leader she had ever encountered. But instead of criticism, she saw something unexpected in the general's expression. His stern features had shifted to something approaching shock, and he had taken a small step backward. "Cadet Martinez," the general said, his voice noticeably different from the authoritative tone he had used moments before. "May I ask where you acquired those boots?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah could feel every eye in the formation focused on her and her worn footwear. "They belonged to my grandfather, sir," Sarah answered honestly, unsure of why the general seemed so affected by her response. "He served in Vietnam, and my mother gave them to me when I couldn't afford new ones for the academy." Sarah expected her admission of financial hardship to further diminish her standing, but the general's reaction was completely unexpected. The general knelt down in front of Sarah, his action sending shockwaves through the assembled cadets. High-ranking military officials simply did not kneel before lowly cadets, especially not to examine worn-out boots. But General Harrison seemed oblivious to protocol as he carefully examined the leather, his fingers tracing patterns that were invisible to everyone else watching the extraordinary scene unfold. "What was your grandfather's name, cadet?" the general asked quietly, his voice carrying a weight that Sarah couldn't understand. The entire formation had fallen silent, with even the instructors watching in bewilderment as one of the military's most decorated leaders continued his unprecedented examination of a cadet's footwear. "Staff Sergeant Roberto Martinez, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her confusion. "He served with the 1st Infantry Division." As soon as she spoke her grandfather's name and unit, the general's reaction became even more pronounced. He looked up at Sarah with an expression of recognition and something approaching reverence. "The Big Red One," the general whispered, using the division's famous nickname. He stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face as if he was seeing her for the first time. The transformation in his demeanor was so complete that even the most privileged cadets in the formation began to sense that something significant was happening, though none of them could understand what. General Harrison turned to face the assembled cadets and instructors, his command presence returning in full force. "I want everyone to understand something," he announced in a voice that carried across the entire courtyard. "True military heritage isn't measured by the newness of your equipment or the polish on your boots. It's measured by the service and sacrifice of those who came before us, and by our own commitment to upholding their legacy." The general's words created a ripple of confusion among the cadets who had spent so much time mocking Sarah's appearance. They began to sense that their understanding of the situation was fundamentally flawed, but they still couldn't comprehend the true significance of what was unfolding before them. "Cadet Martinez," the general continued, "I would like to speak with you privately after this inspection is complete. There are some things about your grandfather's service that I believe you should know." His statement sent another wave of shock through the formation. Private meetings with visiting generals were unprecedented for first-year cadets, and the request only added to the growing mystery surrounding Sarah and her boots. As the inspection continued, the dynamic among the cadets began to shift dramatically. The confident smirks and whispered comments about Sarah's appearance had been replaced by uncertainty and growing curiosity. Even Cadet Richardson, who had been the most vocal in his criticism, seemed subdued as he tried to process what he had witnessed. Sarah herself was overwhelmed by the turn of events. In the space of a few minutes, she had gone from expecting public humiliation to receiving unprecedented attention from one of the military's most respected leaders. The boots that had been the source of constant embarrassment were suddenly the center of a mystery that she didn't understand but was desperate to solve. The remainder of the inspection passed in a blur of routine activities, but Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's attention on her. The general completed his review of the other cadets with his usual thoroughness, but it was clear that his focus had fundamentally shifted. When he spoke to other cadets, his responses seemed automatic, as if his mind was elsewhere, processing the implications of his discovery. As the formation was finally dismissed, Sarah found herself both excited and terrified about the private meeting that awaited her. She had no idea what secrets her grandfather's boots might hold, but she was beginning to understand that her family's military legacy was far more significant than she had ever imagined. The boots that had brought her so much shame were about to reveal a story that would change not only her understanding of her own heritage, but also her standing among her peers forever. General Harrison's private office at the academy had been hastily prepared for their meeting, but Sarah barely noticed the prestigious surroundings as she sat across from the legendary military leader. The general had requested that they be completely alone, dismissing even his aide, and closing the door with unusual emphasis. The gravity of the situation was evident in every aspect of his demeanor as he settled into his chair and fixed his intense gaze on Sarah. "Cadet Martinez," the general began, his voice carrying a solemnity that made Sarah straighten unconsciously in her seat. "Before we discuss your grandfather, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you has been classified for over 40 years. The only reason I can share this information with you now is because of those boots and what they represent." Sarah felt her heart racing as the implications of his words sank in. Her grandfather's service had always been described in general terms by her family. He had served his country with honor, earned several commendations, and returned home to build a quiet life. But the idea that there were classified aspects to his military record had never occurred to her. "Your grandfather, Staff Sergeant Roberto Martinez, was part of a very special unit within the 1st Infantry Division," the general continued, pulling out a thick file from his briefcase. "What I'm about to show you has never been shared outside of the highest levels of military command. Roberto wasn't just a regular infantry soldier, Sarah. He was part of Operation Phoenix Shield, one of the most classified and dangerous missions of the Vietnam War." The general opened the file and turned it towards Sarah, revealing photographs and documents that took her breath away. The black and white images showed her grandfather, looking impossibly young but unmistakably him, standing with a small group of elite soldiers. But what shocked Sarah most was seeing General Harrison himself in several of the photographs, looking decades younger, but with the same intense eyes she recognized. "I served alongside your grandfather for 8 months in Vietnam," General Harrison explained, his voice softening with memory. "Roberto saved my life not once, but 3 times during our service together. He was the finest soldier I've ever known, and his actions during Operation Phoenix Shield changed the course of that conflict in ways that most people will never understand." Sarah stared at the photographs, trying to reconcile the image of her gentle grandfather, who had spent his later years tending a small garden and teaching her to fish, with the elite soldier depicted in these classified documents. The general seemed to sense her struggle and continued with his explanation. "The engravings in those boots aren't random, Sarah. They're coordinates. Specifically, they mark the locations where your grandfather and our unit conducted 3 separate rescue missions that saved over 200 American prisoners of war. Roberto insisted on carving those coordinates into his boots because he said he never wanted to forget the exact spots where American soldiers had been given their freedom back." The general pointed to specific markings in the photographs, showing Sarah how the same boots she wore every day had been present during some of the most dangerous military operations of their generation. "But there's more," he continued, his expression growing even more serious. "Roberto also carved something else into those boots, something that we thought had been lost forever." General Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed intently on Sarah's face. "Your grandfather discovered the location of a missing military payroll worth over $50 million in today's money. The coordinates of that cache are also carved into your boots, along with a coded message that only a few people in the world would be able to decipher. We searched for those coordinates for years after the war ended, but Roberto had promised to take that secret to his grave." Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process the magnitude of what she was learning. The boots that her classmates had mocked and ridiculed contained information that military leaders had been seeking for decades. Her grandfather hadn't just been a war hero. He had been the keeper of one of the military's most closely guarded secrets. But why didn't he ever tell anyone? Sarah asked, finding her voice despite her shock. Why keep it secret for so long? The general's expression softened as he prepared to share what was clearly the most difficult part of the story. Because Roberto discovered that the missing payroll hadn't been lost in combat, the general replied gravely. It had been stolen by American officers who planned to sell it on the black market. Your grandfather gathered evidence of the conspiracy, but before he could report it through proper channels, those same officers tried to have him killed. The official record shows that Roberto was wounded in an enemy attack, but the truth is that he was shot by his own countrymen who wanted to silence him. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her grandfather had never spoken about how he received his injuries, always deflecting questions about his service wounds with gentle humor. Now she understood that his reluctance to discuss the war hadn't been due to typical veteran's reticence, but because he had carried the weight of betrayal and conspiracy for his entire adult life. Roberto survived the assassination attempt and managed to escape with the evidence and the coordinates, the general continued. But he realized that he couldn't trust anyone in the official chain of command. So he made a decision that probably saved his life. He chose to disappear into civilian life and keep the secret hidden until he could be certain that the corrupt officers were no longer in positions of power. General Harrison stood and walked to the window, his posture reflecting the gravity of the story he was sharing. Those officers were eventually discovered and prosecuted, but by then, Roberto had built a new life. He had married your grandmother, started a family, and found peace. When I tried to contact him years later to explain that it was safe to reveal the truth, he told me that he had chosen to let sleeping dogs lie. He said the war had taken enough from him, and he wasn't going to let it take his future too. Sarah found herself thinking about her grandfather's quiet strength, his unwavering moral compass, and his dedication to his family. The man who had taught her about integrity and courage had been living with one of the most significant secrets in military history. But he kept the boots, she said quietly, beginning to understand her grandfather's complex legacy. He kept the boots because he wanted someone in his family to know the truth someday, the general confirmed, returning to his seat. Roberto told me years ago that he had carved the information into his boots as insurance, hoping that if anything ever happened to him, someone would eventually discover the markings and understand their significance. He never imagined it would be his granddaughter, wearing those boots at a military academy, who would finally bring this story full circle. The general reached into his file and pulled out several additional documents. Sarah, your grandfather's actions during Operation Phoenix Shield earned him the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the Purple Heart. But because the mission was classified, he could never publicly receive these honors. The military has been waiting for the right moment to properly recognize his service and his sacrifice. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized the full scope of her grandfather's heroism and the injustice he had endured. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Now, General Harrison said with a smile that transformed his stern features, we finally give Staff Sergeant Roberto Martinez the recognition he deserves. And we make sure that his granddaughter receives every opportunity to honor his legacy through her own service. Those cadets who mocked your boots had no idea they were ridiculing one of the most significant pieces of military history in our nation's possession. The general's words marked the beginning of a transformation that would extend far beyond Sarah's personal circumstances. Her grandfather's secret was about to become public knowledge, and with it would come a reckoning for all those who had judged her based on appearances rather than character. The boots that had brought her shame were about to become symbols of honor, sacrifice, and the enduring power of truth to triumph over prejudice and ignorance. As Sarah prepared to leave the general's office, she understood that her life at the academy would never be the same. But, more importantly, she finally understood the true meaning of the legacy her grandfather had passed down to her, hidden in plain sight in a pair of worn leather boots that contained the secrets of heroes. The transformation began immediately after Sarah's meeting with General Harrison. Within hours, word had spread through the academy's command structure that something extraordinary had been discovered, though the specific details remained classified. Sarah found herself suddenly exempt from normal cadet duties as military historians, and intelligence officers arrived to examine her grandfather's boots and verify the information contained within them. The change in how the academy staff treated Sarah was immediate and dramatic. Instructors who had barely acknowledged her existence now approached her with obvious respect, and senior officers who had never spoken to first-year cadets made special efforts to check on her welfare. The contrast with her previous treatment was so stark that even the most oblivious cadets began to sense that something fundamental had shifted. Cadet Richardson and his circle of privileged followers found themselves increasingly isolated as word spread that Sarah Martinez was now under the direct protection and interest of General Harrison himself. Their previous confidence evaporated as they realized that their campaign of mockery had targeted someone with connections to the highest levels of military leadership. The irony was not lost on anyone that the boots they had ridiculed contained more military history than all of their family legacies combined. 3 days after the initial discovery, General Harrison called for a full assembly of the academy. Every cadet, instructor, and staff member was required to attend what was described as a special presentation on military heritage and honor. Sarah sat in the front row, wearing her grandfather's boots with pride for the first time since arriving at the academy. The transformation in her posture and confidence was evident to everyone present. General Harrison took the stage with the commanding presence that had made him a legend throughout the military community. Behind him, a large screen displayed the title Hidden Heroes, the True Cost of Service. The assembled crowd fell silent as the general began to speak about the nature of heroism and the danger of judging others based on superficial appearances. Today I want to tell you about a soldier named Roberto Martinez, the general announced, his voice carrying clearly throughout the packed auditorium. Staff Sergeant Martinez served his country with distinction during the Vietnam War, but his greatest acts of heroism have remained classified until today. This soldier's granddaughter sits among you, and many of you know her well. Sarah felt hundreds of eyes turned toward her as the general continued his presentation. On the screen behind him, the previously classified photographs from Operation Phoenix Shield appeared, showing her grandfather and his unit during their most dangerous missions. The images were striking in their intensity, depicting young soldiers in situations that clearly demanded extraordinary courage and skill. Roberto Martinez and his unit rescued over 200 American prisoners of war during their 8 months of classified operations, the general explained as more photographs and documents appeared on the screen. But Roberto's service came at a tremendous personal cost. He was wounded not by enemy fire, but by corrupt American officers who tried to murder him to protect their criminal activities. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembly. The idea that an American soldier had been targeted for assassination by his own countrymen was almost incomprehensible to the young cadets, many of whom had grown up with idealized notions of military service. The general allowed the gravity of his words to sink in before continuing with his presentation. Despite being betrayed by those he trusted, Roberto Martinez continued to serve his country even after returning home, the general said, his voice growing more intense. For over 40 years, he carried vital military intelligence in a place where no one would think to look for it. He hid the evidence of his heroism and the proof of others' corruption in his combat boots, waiting for the day when justice could finally be served. The screen now showed detailed images of the engravings inside the boots, with expert analysis revealing the coordinates and coded messages that had remained hidden for decades. The complexity and significance of the information was staggering, representing intelligence that military strategists had assumed was lost forever. Those boots, the general said, pointing directly at Sarah's feet, contain information that has been sought by military historians and intelligence agencies for 4 decades. The young woman wearing them has been mocked and ridiculed by some of you for the very objects that represent one of the most significant pieces of military heritage in our nation's history. The silence in the auditorium was deafening as the implications of the general's words became clear. Cadet Richardson, sitting several rows behind Sarah, felt his face burning with shame as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The boots he had called garbage were actually priceless artifacts, and the young woman he had dismissed as unworthy was the heir to one of the most remarkable military legacies any of them had ever encountered. General Harrison's presentation continued with detailed accounts of Roberto Martinez's heroic actions during Operation Phoenix Shield. He described specific missions where Sarah's grandfather had risked his life to save wounded comrades, his discovery of the prisoner of war camps, and his methodical documentation of the corruption that nearly cost him his life. With each revelation, Sarah felt her understanding of her family's history expanding beyond anything she had ever imagined. The military has waited 40 years to properly honor Roberto Martinez's service, the general announced as the screen displayed images of the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, and Purple Heart that had been awarded posthumously to Sarah's grandfather. Today, we not only recognize his heroism, but we also acknowledge our failure to protect him from those who betrayed their oath to serve with honor. The general then turned his attention to the broader lesson of the day's revelations. This story should serve as a reminder to everyone in this room that true military heritage cannot be measured by the expense of your equipment or the prominence of your family name. Character, courage, and commitment to service are the only metrics that matter in determining a soldier's worth. As the presentation concluded, General Harrison announced that Sarah Martinez would be receiving a full scholarship to complete her military education, funded by a special program designed to honor the children and grandchildren of classified heroes. Additionally, her grandfather's boots would be preserved in the National Military Museum, with Sarah receiving an exact replica to continue wearing during her service. The assembly dispersed in stunned silence, with cadets struggling to process the complete reversal of their understanding of Sarah Martinez and her place in the Academy's hierarchy. The young woman they had viewed as an outsider was now recognized as military royalty, connected to legends that most of them could only dream of claiming as part of their heritage. In the days that followed, the transformation in Academy culture was remarkable. Cadets who had previously ignored or mocked Sarah now approached her with genuine respect and requests for friendship. The informal social hierarchy that had placed wealthy cadets at the top was suddenly irrelevant in the face of authentic military heroism. Sarah found herself at the center of a community that finally valued her for who she truly was rather than what she appeared to be. Cadet Richardson, who had been the most vocal in his criticism of Sarah's boots, approached her privately to offer a sincere apology. "I was wrong about everything," he admitted, his previous arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "I never understood what real military heritage looked like." Sarah accepted his apology with grace, understanding that the revelation of her grandfather's story had been educational for everyone involved. As Sarah continued her military education, she carried herself with new confidence, knowing that she was walking in the footsteps of one of her generation's greatest heroes. The boots that had once brought her shame now served as daily reminders of the courage, integrity, and sacrifice that defined true military service. Her grandfather's legacy had finally been revealed, transforming not only Sarah's life, but also the understanding of everyone around her about what it truly means to serve with honor. The story of Roberto Martinez's heroism spread beyond the Academy walls, inspiring a new generation of military personnel to look beyond surface appearances when evaluating their comrades' worth. Sarah Martinez had entered the Academy as an outsider mocked for her worn boots, but she would graduate as a leader shaped by one of the most remarkable military legacies in American history. Her grandfather's secret had finally been revealed, and with it came the recognition that heroes often hide in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to inspire others with their extraordinary stories of service and sacrifice.